You are listening to Curious by Design, where every question is an invitation, every idea is a doorway, and every episode is a chance to see the world a little differently. Hello, and welcome back to Curious by Design. Today's episode isn't just another episode. Today's a celebration because today Curious by Design turns one. Woohoo! I genuinely can't believe I'm saying that out loud. One whole year, 23 episodes, countless rabbit holes, an ever growing library, a Google Keep that's threatening to burst at the seams, and enough rewritten scripts to make me question every life decision I've ever made. But what a year it's been. When I first hit record, I had absolutely no idea where this little podcast would go. I didn't even know if I'd stick with it. I didn't even know if anyone would listen. I didn't know if talking to a microphone in my room would ever feel natural. Turns out it did. Somewhere between recording, editing, researching, and accidentally buying more books than any one person realistically needs, Curious by Design quietly became one of my favorite parts of the week. It's become my creative playground, my thinking space, a place where I get to celebrate brilliant educators, wonderful books, fascinating ideas, and the beautiful mess that is teaching and learning. And the funny thing is, I thought I was making a podcast for you. What I didn't expect was just how much this podcast would teach me. So today, we're doing something a little different. No bookmark series, no caps, no recommendations. Instead, I want to celebrate Curious by Design's very first birthday by sharing 23 things the first year of podcast has taught me. Some are about teaching, some are about creativity, some are about learning, some are about life, some are wonderfully practical. Others are just some random observations from someone who apparently gets unnecessarily excited about phrases like dulcet tones. So let's celebrate and let's get into it. First, you don't need to know everything before you begin. If I'd waited until I knew how to properly record, edit audio, write podcast scripts, choose microphones, or even sound like someone who hosts a podcast, Curious by Design wouldn't exist. I would still be researching microphones or comparing recording software or watching YouTube videos titled Top 10 Mistakes Beginner Podcasters Make. Sometimes we convince ourselves that one more course, one more book, or one more tutorial is all that's standing between us and getting started. Most of the time, it isn't. The thing standing between us and getting started is getting started. I've realized that confidence isn't something that magically appears before you begin. It grows because you begin. And honestly, I'm so glad I didn't wait until I finally felt ready. Because I don't think I ever would have. 2. Consistent doesn't mean never missing a week. This one took me a while to learn. Because we often celebrate consistency as though it means showing up every single week without fail. But life doesn't work like that. Schools don't work like that. Teachers certainly don't work like that. There have been weeks where I have batch recorded 6 episodes because I knew life was about to get busy. And there have been other weeks where simply getting through the school day felt like an achievement. Podcasting had to wait. Earlier, I used to feel guilty about that. Now, not so much. Because I've realized that consistency isn't about never pausing, it's about returning. Life isn't consistent, your workload isn't consistent, your energy isn't consistent. But the things that matter to you can still have a place in your life. You just have to keep making your way back to them. And I think that's a much kinder definition of consistency. 3. Your voice is enough. Exactly as it is. Can I tell you a secret? When you first start recording yourself, you become painfully aware of your own voice, not just how it sounds, but how you come across. Should I sound more polished, more professional, more podcasty? Should I sound like the people I admire? Should I slow down, speed up, use bigger words, smile more? And then the microphone teaches you something rather quickly. The moment you start performing, it sounds like you are performing. And the moment you relax and simply have a conversation, it sounds like you. That was probably one of the biggest lessons this podcast has given me. I don't want Curious by Design to sound like a lecture. I don't want it to sound like someone reading a research paper. I don't want to sound like I've arrived with all the answers, neatly packaged and ready to hand out. I want to sound curious because I am. I've realized that your voice isn't something you discover before you begin. Sometimes you find it by speaking. 4. Silence between episodes isn't failure. Sometimes it's just life. And I think a lot of creators need to hear this. We're constantly surrounded by messages telling us that if you're serious about something, you need to show up relentlessly. Never miss a week, never stop posting, never disappear. But here's what I've learned. Sometimes you're not creating because you're actually living. You're teaching, planning, reading, working, trying new ideas, having conversations, collecting stories, gathering experiences, doing all the things that eventually become the episodes people listen to. A quiet podcast doesn't necessarily mean abandoned podcast. Sometimes it simply means you're busy living the life that gives you something worth talking about. Silent isn't always the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the space between chapters. 5. The best ideas rarely begin with research. I know that sounds incredibly odd coming from someone whose natural habitat is a rabbit hole. Because if you know me, you know I love research. Give me a question, and there's a very good chance you'll find me 3 hours later with 27 tabs open, 3 books beside me, and absolutely no recollection of what I originally was looking for. But here's what I've realized: the best ideas rarely begin there. They usually begin with a conversation. Something a child says, something a colleague casually mentions over lunch, a question from a parent, a moment in class where I stop and think, hang on a second, why do we have to do it this way? That's where curiosity begins. Research comes later. Research helps me understand. It helps me challenge my thinking. It helps me connect the dots. But the spark almost always comes from real life. I've learned that conversations give us questions, and questions are where the really good rabbit holes begin. 6. Curiosity doesn't need a timetable, but showing up does. One of the biggest myths we tell ourselves is that learning happens when we finally find the time. Spoiler alert, that magical pocket of time never arrives. Curiosity doesn't wait for your calendar to clear, it sneaks up on you while you're reading, driving, teaching, scrolling, having a conversation. Suddenly, something catches your attention, and you think, ooh, that's interesting. That's curiosity doing its job. But curiosity on its own isn't enough because you still have to show up for it. Read the article, buy the book, make the note, save the idea, try the strategy, come back to it 6 months later. I've realized that if I truly believe in having a personal curriculum, then I have to make room for it. Not when life becomes less busy, because it won't, but because it's important. Urgent things will always find you. Curiosity sometimes needs you to go looking for it. 7. You owe it to yourself to do better by you. This one feels very personal because as teachers, we're incredibly good at showing up for other people. We'll spend hours planning a lesson, stay back to help a child, reply to one more email, read one more document, do one more thing. And somewhere in all of that, we quietly move ourselves to the bottom of the list. I've done it, probably more times than I care to admit. But this podcast has reminded me of something. I'm allowed to invest in myself too. I'm allowed to buy that book simply because I want to read it, take the course because I'm curious, learn something that has absolutely nothing to do with my appraisal goals, build a podcast because it brings me joy. You don't only learn for your students or your school or your job. You also learn because your life deserves your curiosity too. 8. Necessity is one of the best teachers you'll have. If you'd ever told me a year ago that I'd need to know anything about microphones, audio interfaces, recording levels, noise reduction, teleprompters, I'd have laughed because I didn't start this podcast to become a tech person. I started it because I wanted to have conversations about teaching. But then reality arrived. I needed a way to record. So I figured it out. I needed to edit. So I learnt. I wanted better sound. Down another rabbit hole I went. I needed a teleprompter. Guess what happened next? Another rabbit hole. Necessity has a funny way of making us resourceful. You don't always need another course. Sometimes you just need a problem annoying enough that you decide. Right? I'm figuring out this today. And before you know it, you've learned something you've never imagined you would. 9. Perfect is a lovely excuse to procrastinate. I have very high standards. That's not news. I like doing things well. I enjoy refining, editing, rewriting, changing one sentence 17 times because one word doesn't sound better. It's both a blessing and occasionally a problem. Because there comes a point where you're no longer improving the work, you're simply delaying the moment someone else gets to see it. I've re recorded intros, changed titles, moved paragraphs around, recorded entire episodes again because one sentence annoyed me. Sometimes that's worth it. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a very respectable disguise. So, yes, care deeply, edit ruthlessly, make it better, but eventually press publish. The world can't benefit from work it never gets to see. 10. Gatekeeping is so last season. If you've listened to even one episode of the Bookmark series, you'll know this already. Because why gatekeep? Honestly, I don't understand it. If I read an incredible book, I want to tell you. If I stumble across a brilliant educator, I want you to know them too. If I find a strategy that genuinely makes my teaching better, I'm probably going to recommend it before I've even finished my coffee. Knowledge isn't a competition. Good ideas aren't a limited resource. And I've realized that one of my favorite things about this podcast is introducing people to the people who've inspired me. Books, websites, teachers, researchers, creators, the people who've quietly shaped the educator I've become. Because none of us learns alone. We borrow, we adapt, we build on each other's thinking. So share the resource, recommend the book, credit the person, celebrate good work loudly. The world needs more generous educators, not more gatekeepers. 11. You don't need permission to be passionate about something. One of the funniest things that's happened over the last year is watching people slowly realize that I genuinely get excited about things like assessment rubrics, inquiry planners, brain breaks, stationery, sentence stems, and apparently the phrase dulcet tones. A younger version of me might have thought, that's a bit nerdy. Maybe tone it down. Not anymore. This podcast has taught me that enthusiasm is infectious. If you're genuinely fascinated by something, people lean in. Not because they suddenly love the topic, but because they love watching someone else love it. So here's your reminder and mine. Never apologize for being excited about the things that make your brain light up. Those are usually the things you're meant to keep talking about. 12. Learning looks different for everyone. Schools love neatness, levels, rubrics, benchmarks, timelines, boxes. Life? Not so much. I've met people who need to talk before they understand something, others who need to write, some who need to make, some who need to quietly sit with an idea for days before it finally clicks. And then there are people like me who apparently require approximately 17 notebooks, 6 sticky notes, Google Keep, and a mildly concerning stationery collection before they know what they actually think. And you know what? That's okay. Learning isn't supposed to look identical. It isn't a race. It isn't a recipe. It's meaning making. The moment I stopped expecting everyone to learn the same way, I think I became a better teacher. Because instead of asking, why aren't they learning like this? I started asking, how do they learn best? And that's a much more interesting question. 13. The microphone knows when you're pretending. Honestly, the microphone is brutal. It catches everything. It knows when you're reading. It knows when you're trying too hard. It knows when you're performing instead of talking. And every single time I listen back and think, ew, let's do that again. The episodes I enjoy recording the most are never the ones where I sound like a podcast host. They're the ones where it feels like I'm talking to one person, like we're sitting over coffee, chatting about books, teaching, life, random rabbit holes. That's what I want Curious by Design to feel like. Not a presentation, not a lecture, just a really good conversation. 14. Less really can be more. Earlier, I thought a longer episode automatically meant a better episode. Not anymore. I've realized that listeners don't need more words, they need better ones. Now, whenever I'm editing, I keep asking myself, does this really need to be here? If the answer is no, out it goes painfully. Sometimes my favorite paragraph gets deleted. Sometimes the clever sentence I've been secretly admiring all week disappears. And yes, it hurts a little, but the episode is almost always better for it. I've learned that respecting your listener also means respecting their time. Say what you came to say it well, and then stop. 15. Can we just take a moment to appreciate the real MVPs? My cavalry of stationery. Honestly, where would I be without them? The notebooks, the pens, the sticky notes, the highlighters that I absolutely didn't need, but somehow convinced myself were essential. And then there's Google Keep. Poor thing, it has become my second brain. Every beautiful phrase, every episode idea, every interesting word, every random thought that pops into my head while I'm brushing my teeth, straight into Google Keep. I've realized that learning doesn't always happen when we sit down and decide, right, time to learn. Sometimes learning happens because we simply start beginning to notice a beautiful word, a beautiful sentence, a question, an observation, a tiny spark that whispers, don't forget me. So, years to notebooks, years to sticky notes, years to Google Keep, and years to every random little place that quietly holds our curiosity until we're ready to come back to it. 16. I've stopped apologizing for being excited. One of the nicest things this podcast has taught me is that enthusiasm is infectious. There was probably a time when I would have toned it down. Calm down, Sabrina. It's just a book. No, it is not just a book. It's the book that's about to send me into 3 more rabbit holes, introduce me to 5 new authors, and completely change the way I think about thinking. And that's exciting. Over the last year, I've realized that I get ridiculously excited about the small things. A brilliant classroom strategy, a beautifully designed website, a sentence that makes me stop and think, a resource that solves a problem I'd been wrestling with for weeks. And somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling the need to apologize for that excitement because here's what I discovered. People don't lean in because they've suddenly become fascinated by phonics, inquiry, assessment, or writing. They lean in because you are fascinated by it. Enthusiasm has a funny way of making ordinary things feel extraordinary. And if there's one thing Curious by Design taught me, it's perfectly okay to be the person who excitedly says, "Wait, I have to show you this." In fact, I hope I never stop being that person. 17. Learning is better when it's shared. One of the nicest surprises this year has been realizing just how much joy there is in sharing what you're learning. A book recommendation, a classroom strategy, a website, a podcast, a question that's been sitting in your head. Every time I came across something interesting, my first instinct wasn't, "That's useful." It was, "Oh, I need to tell someone about this." And somehow that's exactly how Curious by Design was born. What started as a collection of things I found fascinating slowly became conversations with other educators, readers, learners, and wonderfully curious people. And here's what I've discovered: learning doesn't shrink when you share it, it grows. A recommendation becomes a conversation becomes a new idea. A new idea becomes something neither of you would have reached on your own. That's magic. And I think that's why this podcast has felt so natural to me. Because at its heart, it's never really been about teaching or books or resources. It's simply been about sharing things that made me stop and think. That's interesting. And hoping they do the same for someone else. Because really, why gatekeep? 18. Self care isn't always bubble baths. Sometimes it's a really good system. This year has completely changed the way I think about self care. Don't get me wrong, a holiday, a good cup of coffee, or curling up with a book absolutely counts. But I've realized that self care can also look surprisingly ordinary. Sometimes it looks like finding a system that makes life just a little easier. It looks like asking, "Surely someone has figured out a better way to do this." And more often than not, someone has. Follow people who generously share their ideas. Read books, listen to podcasts, borrow systems, experiment. Keep what works, let go of what doesn't. One tiny change might save you 5 minutes every day. Another might save you unnecessary stress. A third might simply make your mornings feel calmer. Over the last year, I've become much more intentional about looking for these little hacks. Not because I want to become more productive, but because I want a little more breathing room, a little more energy, a little more joy. Sometimes self care isn't about escaping your life. Sometimes it's about designing one that feels lighter to live. 19. At first, things often feel like they aren't working. This year reminded me of something I think we all need to hear a little more often. At first, things often feel like they aren't working. The first lesson of a new unit, the first week of a new routine, the first chapter of a challenging book, the first attempt at a new skill, the first episode of a podcast. We try something new and secretly hope for signs that it's working. And when those signs don't appear immediately, we start questioning ourselves. Maybe this isn't working. Maybe I'm not good at this. Maybe I should try something else. But I've learned that most worthwhile things begin awkwardly. They begin with uncertainty, with mistakes, with second guessing, with wondering whether all this effort is actually leading anywhere. And more often than not, the problem isn't that something isn't working. It's that we're expecting results before the landing has had time to take root. Because growth is rarely dramatic, it's usually quiet. It's the confidence that appears slowly, the understanding that deepens over time, the progress you only notice when you stop and look back. This year taught me to stay with things a little longer, to be a little more patient, to trust the process a little more than my doubts. Because sometimes things aren't failing, they're simply finding their sea legs, learning how to navigate unfamiliar waters, learning what works, learning what doesn't. And if you're willing to stay with them long enough, you might be surprised by where they eventually take you. 20. The people who inspire you deserve to be named. If you've listened to the bookmark series, you'll know this already. Because why gatekeep? But this lesson goes a little deeper than sharing good resources. It's about giving credit. Every educator I admire today has been shaped by someone else, and so have I. Books have shaped me, teachers have shaped me, researchers, colleagues, podcast hosts, authors, creators, people I've met, people I've never met, people who have quietly changed the way I think. Ideas have histories. Someone asked the question first. Someone did the research. Someone took the time to share what they'd learned, say their name, recommend their work, point people towards them. There is something wonderfully generous about saying, I didn't come up with this, but I'm so glad someone did. 21. Clarity is a kindness. This year reminded me that being clever and being clear are not the same thing. As teachers, we spend a lot of time thinking about what we want to say. But I've learned that what matters even more is what the other person understands. A beautifully written explanation isn't useful if it leaves people confused. A complicated answer isn't always the smartest answer. And sometimes the most difficult thing to do is take a big idea and express it simply. Again and again, I found myself rewriting, rephrasing, cutting things out, not because the ideas weren't important, but because they deserve to be understood. And I think that's true far beyond podcasting. Whether you are teaching, leading a team, having a difficult conversation, or explaining something to a friend, clarity is a kindness. It's a way of saying, I thought about this carefully enough to make it easier for you. And I think the world could use a little more of that. 22. The internet isn't just noise. Let's be honest, the internet doesn't always have the best reputation. We're constantly hearing about misinformation, doom scrolling, distractions, outrage, and algorithms. And yes, all of that exists. But this year reminded me of something else. The internet is also full of incredibly generous people. People who share their ideas freely. People who create resources and give them away. People who answer questions, recommend books, share strategies, and help complete strangers learn something new. Some of my favorite discoveries this year came from people I've never met. A podcast recommendation, a research paper, a website, a book, a classroom strategy, a thoughtful comment that sent me down an entirely new rabbit hole. And when I look back at Curious by Design, I realize just how much of it was built on that generosity. People sharing what they know, people sharing what they're learning, people taking the time to say, hey, I found this. You might find it useful too. And isn't that wonderful? Because beneath all the noise, there is also a community of curious, thoughtful, generous humans trying to make sense of the world together. And I think that's worth celebrating. The internet just isn't noise. Sometimes it's a library, sometimes it's a staff room, and sometimes, if you are very lucky, it's exactly where you find your next great idea. 23. Teaching and learning are the same thing, wearing different hats. And perhaps this is the lesson that sits at the heart of Curious by Design. I don't think teachers ever really stop being learners, and I don't think learners are simply people waiting to be taught. We're all teaching each other something. Our students teach us, our colleagues teach us, the books we read teach us, the conversations we have teach us. Sometimes, even our mistakes teach us. So perhaps that's why Curious by Design has always felt so natural to me. Because teaching and learning were never really separate things. They're simply the same thing, wearing different hats. And before we wrap up, can we just take a moment? Today, Curious by Design turns one. Happy birthday, my little podcast. What started as one microphone, one curious mind, and one slightly nervous press of the record button has quietly grown into 23 episodes, countless rabbit holes, overflowing bookshelves, and a community of wonderfully curious people. And I honestly couldn't have asked for a better first year. So thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing episodes with your friends and colleagues. Thank you for your recommendations, your messages, your encouragement, and for making this little corner of the internet feel so warm and welcoming. Curious by Design may have started with one microphone, but it was never meant to be a conversation with myself. It was always meant to be a conversation with curious people. And I'm so grateful you are one of them. Year one is done. And what a beautiful year it's been. Year two, it's only just getting started. And I genuinely can't wait to see where it takes us. Here's to more questions, more rabbit holes, more books, more stories, more laughter, more learning, and so much more curiosity. And who knows, maybe we'll take this little podcasting world by storm together. This is Sabrina signing off. Curiously yours.